Good day, ladies and gentlemen. If you were the Pope, what would you do to fix the Catholic Church? This is hypothetical, and I've thought about this a lot. Not that I think I'm going to be or should be Pope, but it's just a thought experiment. I have a few ideas that I want to share with you, and I want to know what you think. So let me know what you think in the comments, because this is just for fun, and who knows what will come of it. Stay tuned. So I was speaking at a conference in Ireland last summer. Actually, I think, well, it was technically this summer, but I think it was technically, was it September or the last day of August? Whatever. And there was a panel after with the conference speakers, and there were questions from the audience. And one of them was, if you could do three things, what would you do to fix the church, or something like that? And something like, if you were Pope, what would you do? And I think the questioner actually wrote, besides make beards normal again amongst priests or something. And I gave some quick answers, and I've thought about it a lot, and I wanted to share my ideas with you. Now, these are in no particular order necessarily of importance. They're just the thoughts that I have, and this is all hypothetical, so take it as you will. But I'm going to go through about 6 or 7 points here that I think would be doable and I think would be really helpful. Now, we have to remember as well, if we got to the point where a pope was legitimately going to fix things and the church was returning to tradition, then we'd be in a situation where that was possible. So there must be a renaissance of orthodoxy and liturgical piety and so forth. So it's a hypothetical scenario that we're not in right now. But if we could imagine that, this is kind of what I think I would do. The first thing that I would hypothetically do is I would have an interdict on ordinations, meaning I would stop all of the ordinations worldwide except for in seminaries that were vetted by either myself or someone who I trusted. So, for example, I think we can trust the ordinations of priests from a good traditional seminary because they're forming good priests. But I'd be pretty strict on it, because here's the thing. Even in the good, relatively good Novus Ordo seminaries, there is so much modernism that is in the water. There are so many modernist tendencies that are in the general formational spirit. Formative spirit's probably, I don't think formational is a word. Formative spirit of moral theology, liturgical theology. There's a lot of problems, and I think it would take at least 3 years to really do an intensive fix of that. So I don't know what that would look like, but you have men in their 7th year ready to be ordained. I would say, well, listen, you've got to be willing to be in seminary for 3 more years before we can ordain you. And if they don't want to and they leave, well, that's probably a good sign. As far as the younger ones, you'd have to have some sort of cutoff. You'd have to have some sort of standardized thing. If you're in your first year, do you have to do 7 more years, or is it 6 intensive years? I don't know. But nonetheless, I think that there would necessarily have to be an interdict on ordinations, because if we're in the position where we're primed for the church to return to tradition, you've got to stop the terrible priests coming out of the really modernist seminaries. And we must fully expect that would mean there would be fewer ordained priests for a while. But it's better to have fewer, modernists coming out and wait a bit and have good priests coming through than to sort of compromise, because that would just perpetuate the process. The next thing I would do, this might sound strange, I would have an interdict on receiving Holy Communion, except for, in danger of death and viaticum and things like that. I would have an interdict on receiving Holy Communion for 1 month, 4 Sundays, at least, except for in traditional parishes. Why? And I should also say, if I was Pope, hypothetically, I would probably have some advisors that I trusted. I don't know. They could gather information, and I could say it's at your discretion if you know of other places that can that are we can trust that they are forming their people with good Eucharistic piety and so forth. And it's a little subjective, of course. And does this include the Byzantine Rite? I don't know. I'm just thinking about the Eastern or the Roman Rite Catholics right now. But the reason is not just for liturgical abuse. There's a lot of that, but also there are just so many Catholics worldwide who are condemning themselves by approaching Holy Communion every Sunday when they're living in, invalid marriages and things like that. And until they're told no, and until everybody's told why, then we've got a problem. And I should probably add, this ban would probably be just for Sunday Mass. And I think kind of daily Mass going Catholics who believe the faith, I think they'd probably rejoice at this, knowing why this was happening. And the reason why I would allow traditional parishes or parishes that were approved by kind of people who knew that this place was somewhere where the faith was taken seriously, I think there's no point in stopping those because the formation's already there. And of course, we can never guarantee that all Catholics are predisposed to receive Holy Communion. That's up to them and between them and God and their confessor. But we have to at least try. And I think if we had a moratorium for at least a month, this would show that we are not going to just hand the Holy Eucharist out like a Eucharistic Pez dispenser anymore. And we're going to take sacrilege and mortal sin very seriously. And it may be that a bunch of Catholics who are prideful and think they deserve it would, stomp their feet and storm out of the church. Well, that's a good sign, because that means that everyone knows that the party is over and it's time to get back into action. And this leads me to another point that would, another 2 points that would play off of this. In that time, there would be an insistence through a mass communication throughout the world that this month, or let's call it, even if it's 6 weeks to 8 weeks, this period is a time for massive confessions. Stop everything you're doing. Priests in every diocese, priests wherever, you're going to be doing everything in your power to be hearing confessions for 10 hours a day. No more just at 4:30 on Saturday before this 5 p.m. Mass. None of that stuff anymore. You're hearing confessions from dawn till dusk. And you're going to be making sure that the parishioners know this. I mean, look at it this way, okay? Think about the COVID time, okay? They were able to communicate to basically every Catholic on earth how the stupid COVID liturgies were going to go in a matter of minutes. I mean, I've never seen prelates and hierarchs of the church work so fast as they did when it came to shutting down the sacraments and when it came to having ridiculous liturgies with hand sanitizer masks and, the egregious ways of receiving Holy Communion. There was a lot of organization that went on really fast, and people really got to work so they could do nothing. The opposite must be true. So this mass confession time would be, you're a priest, you are going to go to every Catholic school, which I'll talk about schools in a sec. And if this school is under the diocese especially, that school will be informed by the bishop. If you like to continue calling yourself Catholic, you are going to, every student in your school is allowed to leave the classroom at any time to go to confession. And the priests will be here all day for 30 days. Something like that. I don't know. But the problem with the confessions in the modernist period here in the church as well is that people are receiving egregious advice in the confessional. So there would have to be some instruction for the priest as well. There would have to be some sort of communication that, okay, here's the information. Here's how you're required to do your confessions for the next while until we can do a bunch of sort of reformation. And I would say something like, for this time period, you're not going to give any advice on what to do. And hear me out here. You're not going to say, here's how you should combat this or that. And again, there's going to be concessions for traditional parishes and so forth. But, Mr. Novus Ordo priest who's been telling people about eco-sins for the last 6 years of your priesthood, you're not going to tell people something's not a sin in the confessional. They're going to come and confess what they want to confess. And whatever they confess, you're going to say, please pick up that booklet that we have for you on the table outside in the vestibule or whatever. And all of the different types of sins are listed in there with advice on how to overcome vices from great moral theologians. It would have to be something like that. If somebody comes in and says, I've got sins against the 6th and 9th commandment, the priest is going to say, great, there's a booklet out there. It lists all the different things. There's links for the internet to know more, blah, 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 blah. You are forgiven. It's got to be something like that. Just get the people in, stop the sacraments, stop handing out Holy Communion like it's going out of style, stop the sacrilege, and get people into the confessional. You've got to have some sort of effort there. It's a matter of cauterizing a wound and stopping the bleeding. So that's something that I would consider. Now, in conjunction with that, we have terrible preaching in so many parishes. And again, there would be concessions for, traditional places, but there's terrible preaching all over the place. And again, think back to the COVID time. You could get all the priests and all the bishops on earth to do the same thing, put the stickers in the same spot, make sure everyone stocks up on hand sanitizer, whatever. I remember there was a video that came out in my diocese by the diocese about how to receive Holy Communion when you return to Mass. And it was an instructional video. And it was like 5 minutes long. It was not high budget, but it was sent to everybody. And everyone who went back to Mass watched it. And I remember thinking, and it was so stupid. It was like, come up with your hands out and have your mask. And then you receive Holy Communion from the priest. Then hold Jesus in your hand with one hand. No danger of dropping him there. And then open your mask and then put Jesus into your mouth. And then put your mask back on and then walk back to your pew and sit 6 feet away from somebody and pray. There was probably hand sanitizer in that process at some point. And I'm thinking to myself, my goodness gracious, you could do that stuff for a lot of things that are good. Whatever. You get my point. So the preaching is so bad, there would have to be some sort of, you're assuming when you have this Pope who is excellent, that he's going to have, a good team, and he's going to have, the head of the Holy Office or the Congregation Doctrine of the Faith, whatever he changes the name back to. You're going to have someone who you trust or a number of people who you trust to produce documents for you that are orthodox. You have to vet them, but you're going to have that. So it'd be something like for 12 weeks, in every parish on earth, and even the traditional parishes, because why not? We could all use some catechesis. But in every parish on earth, for 12 weeks, you're going through a 20-minute sermon, roughly, where you're basically going through the Baltimore Catechism, or you're going through the Catechism of Pius X, or something like that, broken down. And it would have to be nice and formatted, and which would not be hard to do. And every priest on earth is required to read this. No exceptions. I don't care, no exceptions. No exceptions. And I would even make it that the bishops themselves in their cathedrals would have to say Sunday Mass for the faithful, and they would have to read this formation, read this catechism stuff to form the faithful. A lot of people would get mad. I don't care. We've, cared about people's feelings way too much, and look where we are now. And this would lead me to another thing, because we've talked about stopping Holy Communion. We've talked about moratorium on advice in the confessional, but making sure we get people to the confessional. We've talked about an interdict on ordinations and so forth. So what do we do about the Mass? Well, here's the thing. I'll reference Archbishop Lefebvre, for example. Archbishop Lefebvre, I'm paraphrasing here, but he'd be asked things like, when will the church be out of the crisis, or what's going on, when will things be normal, or whatever. And the answer, this typical answer was basically something like when the church returns to tradition. The thing is, there's not a blueprint for that. I mean, we don't know kind of exactly what that would look like. Does that mean like overnight there's a switch to the Latin Mass? A lot of priests can't say the Latin Mass without difficulty, without a lot of training. How long is that going to take? What about the Eastern rites who still have nice liturgy, but they have a lot of modernism? I mean, it's a big thing. So, I mean, what would be practical steps where we could say the church is returning to tradition? Well, here would be my hypothetical. Again, going back to the COVID time. We can get priests to do things pretty fast. We can get bishops to do things pretty fast if they've got a fire under their butt. Well, you can easily say the vernacular translation of the Old Mass, no matter who you are. That's not hard to do. Like a 10-year-old can read his missal and read the translation. Now, perhaps for the sake of transition, maybe you shorten it a bit, like not in a where you chop it up, but it's like, okay, we'll omit certain parts for now. But with the advent of technology and sending PDFs all over the world, etc., I mean, there'd be no reason why within a week, with a few people working on it for the major languages, that you couldn't have basically PDFs of liturgical books en masse emailed out and require everybody to go to a nice printer and at least put it in some sort of bound book just for the time being before you get more official things. I mean, that wouldn't be hard to do. Again, thinking back to the COVID time when they did a bunch of stuff that was difficult, but they had motivation to do so because they were all scared of catching a cold. So I would say something like that. And a lot of priests who are older, they're just not going to learn to say the Old Mass. It's not going to happen. But they can turn around on their table altars and they can say a shortened version of the Old Mass in their vernacular. And they can learn the sacred digits with their fingers. That's not that hard. They may not have all the postures. They may not have all the, let's say, the skills that you learn. But fine. But you can, again, we're stopping the bleeding and we're getting things back. And then I would say, you have like, let's say 2 years for all priests under the age of 60 or something, where they have to, within 2 years, be saying the traditional Latin Mass. Many of them will not be able to sing it because they've never learned to chant. Okay, that's fine. You can make provisions. You only say low masses or whatever. But I think that that's pretty doable. And I know some people might think, hey, we should never compromise and translate the Mass or whatever. This is a transitional period. If you could say, if I told you that tomorrow you were going to wake up, if you're a trad, like a real quote unquote rad trad, and you are TLM supremacist, hey, I'm with you. But if I said you could wake up tomorrow and all the priests in the world, no matter the parish, whether they have a high altar or not, they're turned around and they're saying the Old Mass, but in their language, would that be a win? Of course it'd be a win. It'd be a huge win. And if there's any spots that are hard to translate properly, you could have some Latin parts in there with some phonetic spelling. I mean, goodness gracious, with the technology today, why can't the Vatican make a YouTube channel where they teach you how to say words? I mean, you know what I mean? I could do that. Here's how you say this word, spiritu, domino. You don't have to, it's not that hard to learn the basics. You could say the consecration in Latin, hoc est enim corpus, it's not hard to do. You don't have to be a scholar. I think that'd be pretty cool. And doable. I think it'd be very doable, actually. I think they could do it right now. They could do that right now if they wanted to, just the way they did everything for COVID. So those will be the sort of swift but practical changes to the Mass, again, with some sort of transitionary period towards a place where Roman Rite priests are saying the traditional Latin Mass. There would be a whole other conversation for various Eastern rites, because various Eastern rites like the Chaldeans and stuff, it's basically the Novus Ordo with Arabic at this point in many places. You'd have to obviously lay the hammer down with some of these Eastern churches, which are not ideal. as much as people might think. They have modernism as much as anyone. They just have prettier churches and smells and bells a lot of the time. In any event, the next thing I would do is I would assign SSPX priests to be the rectors or overseers of the approved seminaries. Now, it might not only have to be SSPX, but I just use that as a standard. Because, a lot of seminaries would have to be closed. Not necessarily sell the building, because you hopefully will need it within a decade or two, because you'd have a lot more vocations if the church returned to tradition. But, I think it was in Ireland, they didn't ordain a single priest a couple years ago. I mean, what's the population of Ireland? 4 million or something? Mass attendance there is lower than it used to be, obviously, but it's still higher than a lot of places. There's still a lot of Catholics going to Mass relative to some of the worst countries. I think you would have to close a lot of seminaries. I don't think there'd be a lot of seminaries left. I mean, why would you have a seminary in Ireland at this point if there's no ordinations, and then on a good year there's like 4? I think that we would have to see some kind of like, people may not know the general history of seminaries. The way that priests were formed did change over time. For the longest time it was almost more like an apprentice thing, or it was through living in community life, common life with a monastery or something like that, and you'd be formed in that way. That's still common for the traditional Dominicans, of which there are a few. I think the Novus Ordo Dominicans still follow the same way, but just not with traditional doctrine. The seminary was introduced, generally speaking, around the time of the Council of Trent, in order to basically shore up the formations of priests, and it was a great not innovation, but it was a great standardization mechanism, because there were problems, hence why we had the Protestant Reformation, right? I mean, Catholics wouldn't have been fooled by Martin Luther if they knew their faith, right? Because if you know anything about Catholicism and you're raised in it and you study it to the level of just knowing your Baltimore Catechism, it's pretty easy to understand why Luther is incorrect. So the seminary sort of stepped in and became like, priest factories. And that was good. It was great. Well, obviously the devil always uses good things and perverts them, and he's used the seminaries to make them into, modernism factories. So I think a lot of seminaries would have to close. And I think that would mean that you would have a lot of international seminaries. Like here in Canada, my diocese has a seminary. There might be a dozen, maybe. Like there's very few ordinations every year. I don't know it's not very many. Toronto has a couple seminaries. One is sort of only a 4-year one, though. St. Philip Neri is a 4-year, but you have to go somewhere else for the 3 years. St. Augustine's is the diocesan one. It's not that many. Edmonton has one. I think there's really not that many. There are not that many seminarians in Canada. I mean, you could have every single seminarian in Canada moved to a single seminary with a good rector and a good team, and not have to have that many seminaries open, so you wouldn't need that many seminary rectors. I said SSPX priests, but I'm sure there could be others. It was just a for instance. So in my country, you could easily boil it down to one. I mean, think about the fact, if you go to St. Mary's, Kansas, and there's this school that Archbishop Lefebvre procured, and it was a Jesuit seminary, basically. It was like a college and a seminary, and there was hundreds, if not thousands, of ordinations there over the years, over the 100 years it was open or whatever it was. And that was just the one. And, there were lots of other ones. You could put all the seminarians in my whole country into one seminary. There's some big buildings out there. And you could do things in the States like, okay, they can't all go into one seminary, but you could have like 5 or something, right? A lot of seminarians are going to leave the seminary when these changes happen, which is good because they're modernists. Otherwise, they'd stick around. I think if you whittle it down, and I think you have some major international seminaries in countries and really hone it down. In Africa, they've got tons of seminarians, but Africa has a huge problem in their seminaries that people don't like to discuss because Africa's like the hope of the church or whatever. But there's a huge problem in Africa right now where, because the situation in so many African economic sectors is so dire, people look at joining the priesthood as like a good job. And there's a lot of concubinage and things like that going on in the church in Africa. So you're still going to have some sweeping reforms there as well. It's not close to perfect. And yeah, that's what I would do. I would appoint very good traditional priests and theologians to be the rectors of these major seminaries and whittle it down. And then hopefully you will be able to use those buildings you've had but aren't in operation because you'll have more vocations in, let's say, 10, 20, 30 years, which I think you would. I really think you would. Okay, this leads me to my next point. Because I just mentioned, for example, that we would have to have a crackdown on a lot of these activities of priests and things like that in order to dissuade modernists and homosexuals and perverts and stuff from becoming priests, even in a place like Africa where there's a lot of concubinage going on. Well, this is where you have to do something with canon law, and you have to basically, and canon law was not perfect in 1917. There are good arguments to suggest that a universal code of canon law was maybe a mistake. That's another conversation for another day. I don't have enough of a capacity to make an argument for or against. I'm just saying I've heard that before from people I think are pretty smart. Okay, well, either way, the old code of canon law and the traditional codes of canon law in the various jurisdictions in the world had very strict penalties for deviance on behalf of priests. You have to bring that back in. You have to bring that back in to make sure that even in places like Africa, if there is any, sexual crime committed by a priest, which would include fornication in a non-homosexual way, but just stepping out on your vows, it's like you're either done and you're defrocked, or maybe if it's a natural crime versus an unnatural crime, you're on a serious penance for a while, like you're 5 years in a monastery or something like that. I don't know. And you have the option to leave if you want, if you don't want to do the monastery penance, but there has to be something like that, which would dissuade a number of seminarians. And it would show the faithful that we mean business. And it would get a lot of the bad actors out of the priesthood because it wouldn't be hard to prove a lot of them are stepping out on their vows. I think that would be important. So it'd have to be some sort of canon law fix. The next thing I would do, and this might be the most disruptive in a sense, because these would all be disruptive. I mean, there's no easy way to do this. I mean, we're talking about, like, there's cancer and you've got to remove some limbs. So you can die slowly, or you can cut off a couple legs right now and do some brain surgery and a bunch of chemo and live. Like, you're going to be you're going to feel sicker for a while before you get better. There's no way around that. Returning to tradition, the church returning to a state of prosperity and health doctrinally and so forth. Unless there is some miraculous act by God, like a Fatima 2 that everybody sees live streamed, I don't know, or something where it's like nobody denies it and it's happening. Hearts are changed by the billions. Unless something like that happens, it's going to be a war of attrition, which it is. I have a priest friend in the Society of St. Pius X, and he says he gets emails all the time from young seminarians and newly ordained priests in the Novus Ordo who discover tradition. He gets emails, and he says none of them want anything to do with Vatican II. I know a young priest who's discovered tradition, and he's trying to navigate how to do that, won't say the new Mass anymore, that kind of thing. And we were talking, and, he was harder on Vatican II than I was, So it's an attrition in the sense that, the spirit of Vatican II has died. It didn't revive under Pope Benedict. I was looking at some statistics today, doing some final edits on my modernism book, which, by the way, is going to be available very, very soon. And I promise I'm telling the truth. The date's changed a couple times, but it's coming out in April. What happened to Catholicism? I was doing some final stuff with the copy editor. You can find a link for that in the description area. You can find all my books at kennedyhall.ca/books. kennedyhall.ca/books, and that's linked underneath. And in any event, I was looking at some statistics about mass attendance for one of the parts of the book. It was like a footnote I had to fix up. And there was a sharp decline of mass attendance under Pope Benedict in America. It was something like, from 2005, it was like 30% or something. Now, I wonder if a number of those people stopped going to Mass because they believed Benedict was too conservative. That's true. But the point is that there wasn't a resurgence in health in the church in any notable way that can be statistically measured in the general sense outside of the resurgence of traditional masses, even under Pope Benedict, because things are so severe. And so there's this attrition that's taking place. And the priests who were ordained in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, who were really formed with like Vatican II was the new springtime kind of thing, a lot of them are going to be retired or dying soon. They already have. And a lot of them are reaching that last 10 to 15 years of their priesthood. And the younger generation just doesn't want to have anything to do with it. So there's an attrition that's going to take place in the next 20 or 30 years if we just watch it play out, maybe 40 years. And naturally speaking, there are going to be so many fewer Catholics attending Mass, so many fewer Catholics going to seminaries in the traditional Novus Ordo, or the not traditional Novus Ordo, because that's an oxymoron, but in the mainstream Novus Ordo setting. So you're going to naturally see this major decline anyway. You may as well get ahead of it and get rid of the diseased tissue faster rather than allow it to eat away at you more. That's the way I look at it. So the last thing that I would consider is, and I wrote in my notes here, radical changes to Catholic schools, closures, obligations, oaths, funding, etc. So what do I mean by that? Well, okay. So in my province, Catholic schools are run by the government. The bishops okay them or something. They approve it or whatever. They make the Catholic curriculum, but they're public schools. They just happen to have a religion class. I know I taught in one. They're a disaster they're just as bad as public schools in most ways. In some cases, some of the boards will withstand, the pressure to have like a pride flag flown because there's enough trustees on the board that are conservative. It's not as bad in some senses, but as far as the education, the curriculum is the same is the point. If the schools are any better, it's because there's this prestige that Catholic schools have. So a lot of parents who want their children to be high flyers educationally will, put a lot of effort into sending their kids to these places, and there's kind of that spirit behind it. But as far as the morals, as far as the Catholicity, as far as the Marxism that's infiltrated education as a whole, all of it is in the Catholic schools here. So in my province, they would have to do something like, because a lot of these properties are on church property. They would have to do something like, I don't know, they'd have to get lawyers involved or something. You're no longer allowed to use this as a publicly funded building or whatever. They'd have to do something radical like that. They'd have to withdraw all of their approval. You are no longer allowed to call this place Catholic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, unless you agree to certain changes. And what would those changes be? Well, a massive change to who's allowed to work at them. A change to the formation of the teachers. You would have to make the teachers take oaths to the magisterium. Say the anti-modernist oath or something like that. The school would have to recite it. You'd have to do crazy stuff like that. You'd have to clean house with textbooks. You'd have to standardize the religion curriculum across the board. It'd be easier to do in a place like the United States where all the Catholic schools are private, and they're private buildings. They're not public sector unions and things like that. In my province, you'd probably just have to close them all, which would be chaos. But that's the situation we're in. The bishops and the hierarchs of the church that have allowed this disease to spread, this is their fault. And they're going to have to do some cleanup on aisle 5 for the mess they've made. And that's going to include a lot of headaches. And they're going to and you're going to have to offer something in replacement, because a lot of people will have to switch schools, or they'll have to homeschool or whatever. And our dioceses, a lot of them have gone bankrupt or whatever, the different types of bankruptcy for abuse settlements and things like that. But I have seen, and I'm sure you have, I have seen these dioceses fundraise like Hall of Fame level fundraising. One of my old parish, the Nova Sordo parish, had to do some renovations, and it was like $2 million or something. And they were able to get that money real easily in a small town. Golf tournaments, whatever. Car auctions, all these things. And they were able to get like $2 million and do it. It was a beautiful renovation, all considered. They didn't restore the high altar or anything, but they really did restore the church beautifully, and it was nice. But they're able to fundraise, is my point. And my diocese is broke. They've had tons of abuse settlements here, selling off properties, all those kinds of things. They're able to fundraise a lot. If they really put their heads together and said, we're closing all these schools, and we're going to open up a few schools for anyone who wants to go as a replacement, they could do that. They could do that. They could find the salaries. They could find the right people for the jobs. Goodness knows a lot of parishes need to be closed, so priests should have more time, and if they're a decent priest, they can teach. I think if you were to bring back that teaching spirit to the religious orders and stuff, I think a lot of young ladies would be more motivated to join the convents and things, to join the nunneries, to become religious sisters. I think that would be pretty great. And there is money. Even if it's not in reserves, they can find the money. And you best believe that there are tons of very wealthy, look at it right now. So many Catholic schools and Catholic organizations in general rely on the generosity of parishioners who are very successful in their personal lives and give huge sums of money for things that they think are good. That would still be the case. In fact, you'd have so many people who were so ecstatic and motivated, and they had been withholding their funds because so many people are no longer donating to their parishes or dioceses until the mess is cleaned up. That's a really common thing. You would have a great repurposing of all these resources. And you could use that to do, radical reformation of teachers. A lot of these teachers who are Catholics, they're poorly formed, but they're not bad people. And they've just been formed as modernists. And in the same way you have an interdict on this and that in the parishes, you have to have a moratorium on religion classes in the schools until there's 6 months past or a year past or something like that, and you figure out something else. But Catholic education would have to take a massive hit. The colleges as well, all of the universities that call themselves Catholic, run by Jesuits and so forth, they need to be so severe on these places. It's like, if you get caught teaching modernism, like you're excommunicated from the church or something. Like, it's got to be severe. And they could do it. Again, they could do it. We saw what they did during COVID. They can sideline priests for not getting vaccinated. That happened in my diocese. They can close down parishes because of spatial requirements. They can make them change a liturgy. They can make instructional. They can do all these things if they want. And another thing that the hierarchy would have to do is they would have to offer parents help. So, for example, okay, if you're going to close down a lot of these schools, which you'd have to do, you'd have to encourage homeschooling. Well, people are going to need help. So every diocese would have to be, particular, a bishop's conference or something. they would have to repurpose, stop giving money to the stupid charities and whatever. All of it comes in-house to fix the bleeding. And they'd have to do something like every parent who is registered at a parish, we will give you $1,200 to get your homeschooling supplies, for up to 4 kids or whatever the number is. I'm just spitballing the numbers. I can't remember how much we pay for all our stuff, but something like that. And they could do it if they wanted to, and they could fundraise for it. One of the biggest problems people have with homeschooling is that in some cases, like the program itself doesn't get you an accreditation. I am certain that with the power and the sway that these bishops have, that they could get various things accredited as being like, you get your diploma, you get your things if you do that. I'm certain there'd be lots of church buildings that would be empty because there'd be closures of parishes, that they could repurpose these to be homeschool co-ops and so forth. If they put their minds to it and put their resources in it, which they have and which they could fundraise because they've proven they can do that for anything else they want, I guarantee you they'd be able to do that. It would just take, ironically, we talk about synodality and stuff, and it's ridiculous, obviously. But in a sense, you find the people in your diocese who are motivated, and instead of, hitting them with a stick when they try to be traditional, you bring those people in and say, tell us what we should do. How should we help all these homeschoolers? How do we start a Catholic elementary school? Who can we have teach, etc.? You could do that. We could all do it. And it would be so amazing. The church would become a lot smaller in a sense, but I really think that time would be short-lived. Have you been to a traditional parish and in the cry room during Mass? It's unbelievable. I think at our chapel, it's like, we might have 140 people or something. We've had like 13 or 15 baptisms in a year or something like that. Something crazy. The growth would be exponential within a decade or two. And it would be such a glorious thing to see. And I would also say the last thing about the Catholic education is I wrote on my notes obligations. And, back in the 20s and 30s, maybe up until the 50s or something, I don't know. But back in the day in the province of Ontario, you would be excommunicated in the diocese of your province. Not by Rome, but excommunicated on a local sense. If you sent your kids to a Protestant school. That's what it was like. And the church was stronger then. You would have to put some sort of obligation. I don't know. You don't have access to this or that if your children are not in Catholic schools. And there's no excuse at this point because, maybe we're closing some schools, but we're giving you all these co-ops and online programs and distance programs and homeschooling resources, and we're paying for it. You'd have to be a little bit delicate with it because the situation's so bad. But you'd have to have some sort of putting people on notice that there's no more bad education allowed, even to the point of excommunication, which used to be the case here in the province of Ontario. And I'm sure that was similar other places because, I know in the United States, they were required to have schools free of charge for all the kids. So there was no excuse not to go. Those things have happened before. They can happen now. All right. That's all I have for you. That's just me spitballing. Maybe I'm out to lunch. I think a lot of that stuff is possible. This is purely hypothetical. But I'd like to know what you think. Be nice to me in the comments. And have some fun conversations. Spitball some ideas. Because guess what, my friends? This war of attrition in the church is happening. And there is going to be a need. I'm 36 years old. Probably in my lifetime. I would say probably by the time I'm my 50s or 60s, we're going to be in a situation where there's a lot of change and collapse and so forth, just demographically, it's impossible to avoid. A lot of us are going to see something like a need for a lot of involvement and, elbow grease to make things better. That's going to be a thing a lot of us are going to have to help with, I hope, and I think it will happen in some way. Let me know what you think in the comments. And until next time, God bless you all.